You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text and Glossa House TV. I am Dr. Michael Halcomb, and today I'm excited to be talking with Dr. David Diener. And I want to make sure I say that name right. David Diener, and he's the Assistant Professor of Education at Hillsdale College. And so, David, it's nice to meet you. This is my first time meeting you, and thrilled to be talking with you. And
thanks, Michael. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So, as I was saying before I hit the record button, I kind of just hit record and see where things are going to go. As I've been looking over your bio page on the Hillsdale website, you're noticing that you've been very active in the classical Christian education movement. So let's just maybe start there. For people who are listening, like from where you sit, what is classical Christian education?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. So I was in the process of doing a PhD, well, 2 PhDs in philosophy and philosophy of education, and I had never heard of classical Christian education. And I initially heard about it from my wife, who we had little kids at the time, and she was going to big homeschool conferences and trying to figure out how we were going to educate our children. And she came home and said, "Hey, I think this classical Christian education is a really cool thing." And I said, "Classical Christian education, what's that?" And so started researching and doing reading and getting involved with the movement. And both for us as a family personally, and also for my career and my work, we really believed that this was something really important that we could give our lives to, and that historically was intimately a part of the life of the church and of the education of Christian children for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah. So did you all end up getting your family involved? Did your children, get enrolled in a classical Christian school, or what did that look like afterward?
Yeah, so we ended up homeschooling. We have 4 children. We ended up homeschooling all of them classically for a number of years. And I when I finished all my doctoral work, had just kind of assumed that I would become a professor at a hopefully Christian liberal arts college. That was kind of the plan. And ended up, through a series of events, getting really involved with the classical Christian school movement. And at one point, turning down a tenure track job as the chair of a philosophy department to go and work as an administrator in a K-12 classical Christian school. And so in terms of my job, that led on a journey of 11 years in executive administration. And I was the headmaster of 2 different classical Christian schools in Texas and then here in Michigan. And a couple of years ago, we launched a master's program in classical education here at Hillsdale College. We have an undergraduate program also in classical education. And when we launched that master's program, as part of that, I moved over full-time into the professor role before I was the headmaster of Hillsdale Academy, a classical Christian school here in Hillsdale as well.
Oh, excellent. Wow. So you had mentioned that prior to, when we started recording, that you sort of just got through conference season and you'd spoken at several classical Christian conferences. So tell us a little bit about those and maybe what you were speaking on.
Sure. So the classical Christian education network has become a really dense and robust network that spans K-12 teachers in schools, homeschoolers, college professors, administrators, think tanks, publishers, consultants, other organizations. This is a huge network of like-minded people all across the country and the world. This is an international movement. So I've been very blessed to be involved with a number of those organizations. And so I serve on the board of directors for the Society for Classical Learning. Our annual conference, summer conference, was just a couple weeks ago in Washington, D.C. And then I also spoke just last week for the Association of Classical and Christian Schools conference, the annual conference. And the CLT, I serve on the board of academic advisors for the CLT, the Classic Learning Test, and am the executive director of the Halcomb Fellowship also. So there's lots of overlapping organizations that are speaking into this movement and trying to help it grow.
Wow. So it's interesting. At the time you and I are recording right now, the interview I did with Jeremy Tate from the CLT just went live yesterday.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, Jeremy's a wonderful man, a great friend.
And I recently just had on Dr. Matt Bianco from the Cersei Institute. So yeah, it's been fun. So I used to teach in a classical Christian school, and my kids were in a classical Christian school all the way up, through middle school essentially. And so I live in Hawaii, and we really only have one of those, but our kids are now, my daughter's about to graduate high school this coming year, and she's a part of a different school at the moment, but we've really missed being out of those circles and out of the movement, and have appreciated everything that was invested in our children prior to. I'm curious, as you look at the classical Christian movement at present, what's still needed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Over the past few decades, people have grown and deepened this movement so much in terms of our understanding of the history and the philosophy. Like I said, for hundreds, thousands of years, what we call today classical Christian education was just education. And so we're not trying to create something new. This is not, a novel idea that somebody just dreamt up a couple months ago or a couple years ago. What we're trying to do is recover and then continue, of course, this long-standing tradition of classical Christian education that really only was left or fell into disrepute or was not the dominant paradigm starting about 150 years ago at the end of the 19th century. So it's really actually a very recent departure from classical Christian education in mainstream. So you asked what I think we need to do. Over the past, like I said, number of decades, we have come to understand in great depth this tradition. I think there is still work to be done to dig up do the archaeological work, as it were. Most of us who I guess are leading the movement now, or many of the people who are involved in leadership positions, we didn't grow up in classical Christian schools. So you and I, you say your children and my children have gotten some classical Christian education, but most of us who are, helping to lead and further conversations, we didn't. And it's really exciting because one of the things that's happening is that we're starting to see that generational shift where people who did go to classical Christian schools or were homeschooled in this approach are now, finishing their degrees and taking teaching positions or administrative positions. So to answer the question, I think that as we move forward, that's going to be important to really pass on the culture, not only of individual schools like yours there in Hawaii or ours here in Hillsdale, but of the movement and of the history of the tradition as well.
Nice. Yeah. I also am wondering, as you look at what's going on sort of writ large with education in the West, particularly in the United States, I'm wondering, as you not pit classical against sort of public or whatever, but I'm wondering, as you sit the sort of standard classical Christian education beside what we're seeing with public schooling in general, what are some of the distinctives of the CCE over and against that, or in contradistinction to that?
Great question. So, I think post-COVID, a lot has changed in the market. A higher percentage of traditional public school parents say that if they had an option, they would send their kids somewhere else. Higher percentages than we've ever seen. There are a lot of sort of practical things. But the key difference that I would want to emphasize is that ultimately the key difference between what we might call mainstream education today and a classical Christian approach has to do with the goals, has to do with the teleology or the telos of what education is for and
Right.
what its purpose is. And within the tradition of classical Christian education, for generations and generations, Christians have been educating and cultivating their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and it was understood that the education is a formation process of the whole person that
Yes.
is directed toward living a life of wisdom and virtue, living a life well lived. We could say a fully human life, or we can talk about this in terms of human flourishing, which of course means giving glory to God and loving God and neighbor, etc. And that those goals then were taken very seriously and were used to then define the curriculum, the pedagogy, the methods, the practical aspects. And what we have today, unfortunately, even in many Christian circles, is a kind of hodgepodge of progressive ideology
Yeah.
and curricular materials and pedagogical practices that, even though we're trying sometimes to use them in order to cultivate disciples of Christ, they're really many times those kind of that hodgepodge of techniques is based on a set of ideals and a set of educational foundational principles that is antithetical to Christianity. And
Right.
so what you get with classical Christian education is you get this beautiful harmony between the Christian formation that we desire to see in our students and this longstanding educational legacy that understands the purpose of education, not primarily as preparation for a job or a
Yeah.
career or college entrance or to make a lot of money or to be successful. Those are not ultimately the goals of education. The ultimate goal of education is to live well, both in this life and in eternity. And when you start with that, okay, now we can talk about what does that mean? And then how do we build a school or a system of education to cultivate it?
Yeah, I love that. And as I look at, what's now, I've talked about this a lot on the podcast, was you look at, what's going on within just society. And you mentioned this hodgepodge of sort of liberalism or progressive ideas. It's a little bit, maybe a lot bit terrifying, actually, to be sending, our little ones into that, our youngsters into that. And, we're seeing some of the craziest stuff now that I couldn't have, even as a public school student, right? I could have never imagined when I was going through school that something like, like a drag queen reading hour would have like flown. Like it just wouldn't, right? It wouldn't have flown. And now like we're all the way to this point, and it's just wild to see. So but it's encouraging to see the growth in the classical movement as well. In distinction to that, I remember I've talked about this a bit too, reading the Benedict option by Rod Dreher. And one of his contentions is, as Christians we need to be building our own schools, and so yeah, it's encouraging to hear that you guys have this program, and now you're raising up the next generation and passing on the baton, and that's precisely what they're doing.
Well, I would just plead with parents. It's not to say that there's one right option for everybody, certainly,
Right.
but I would plead with parents to take seriously the importance of the educational institution in which you place your children, and
Yeah.
to look at it seriously and examine what is being taught and what the goals of the school are or the system of education. Because I think many parents just kind of take it for granted, or at least in the
Yeah.
past have had the privilege of taking it for granted, that the basic assumptions about the world that they have, their school is going to share, or the basic values that they want to pass on to their children that the school is going to share. And unfortunately, that's just not often the case anymore. And so the formative power of the thousands of hours that a student spends in school is
Right.
difficult to overstate. And
Right.
and I think it would be naive not to think that that day after day, hour after hour, kind of human being formation
Yeah.
isn't important. And so that would be what I would say to parents: is take it really seriously. Look at the goals that you have for your child and the goals of the various educational options that you have, and then be wise about the decisions you make.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's sort of a hurdle, having, moved in these circles for a long time, I think one of the things that's maybe the biggest hurdle for families looking at like a classical school is just the cost,
Yeah.
right? In a lot of circumstances and contexts, it's still just cost prohibitive, you know. And so now I'm kind of an outsider looking in, and I'm thinking, if this is really gonna like go to the next level, like some solution has to be to be put forward where it's not as cost prohibitive.
Yep. It's a
um
it's a great point, and there are great strides being taken on two fronts with regard to that. The first one is the classical charter school movement. So these are not explicitly Christian schools, but they are classical charter schools that the growth of those schools has just, in terms of history, lagged a little bit behind the classical Christian schools. Those were kind of and homeschooling was kind of the frontier. But in recent years, the growth of the classical charter school movement has been amazing, wonderful, exceptional. It's the fastest growing sector of all charter schools. And so what many Christian parents have found is, even though it's not an explicitly Christian school, they've found a home for their children there, and an approach to education that in some ways, many ways, is often actually more aligned than what you'd get at a traditional public school, or sometimes even at a nominally Christian school,
huh.
unfortunately. And then the second, so that's one. The second sector has to do with private Christian classical schools becoming much more affordable due to school choice. So again, this is a major issue that is happening in states all across the country. It's gaining momentum. The school choice movement is growing and gaining a lot of political and social momentum. And so what that is offering, and different states do it differently, whether it's a voucher program or a ESA, there are different kinds of structures. But what that's providing is for parents in many states to be able to provide a private classical Christian education for their children without, like you said, the sticker price of full tuition.
When I was talking with Jeremy Tate recently, one of the things that came up with regard to like the classical learning test was, we were talking about the fact that how the tests, the SAT, the ACT, they sort of discriminate against people of faith, right? Religious people. There's the day we're recording this, there's a YouTube short that I put out, a clip of that, and we're talking about that, how on a SAT or an ACT, you're not going to find questions about Thomas Aquinas or Martin Luther, these great influences who have had profound effects on Western society. Someone commented on there, like, don't create a false persecution narrative where there is none. It's just like, well, you kind of just actually proved our point that, it's been overlooked. You're overlooking it as well. But it is interesting. So I'm curious, if we were to lop off the Christian part, you're talking about just classical schools, is that, even though it may not be a classical Christian school, are those things still talked about? Like these great movers and shakers and shapers of Western society. Do you have any insight on that? Are those kind of folks still talked about, or?
No, absolutely they are. And so what you'll get in a classical charter school, for example, all of these great authors, these great thinkers, the Bible is being read, and they're talking about the cultivation of virtue, moral and intellectual virtue, living a life of wisdom. Now, within those contexts, they can't talk about that in explicitly Christian terms, right? There are limits there in terms of the fullness of truth. But to answer your question, absolutely, those kinds of ideas and texts are being discussed. One thing too, as you're mentioning this idea of kind of don't create a false persecution narrative, is that the thing that struck me as you were saying that is that a lot of times what is not communicated is as significant as what is communicated. And so, for example, it might not be that on these tests or in the larger educational narrative, it might not be that people of faith are explicitly scorned or ridiculed or something like that. But how often are people of great intellect and of deep faith put together? Or how often is the life of religious devotion treated in a positive way, right? So there are example after example after example that I think would reinforce the point Jeremy Tate is trying to make. And it's interesting, one quote in C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man that I love, right toward the beginning of that book, he's talking about the importance of early childhood education. And he says that the teacher or the textbook puts an assumption into the student's mind that 10 years hence, I'm not quoting exactly, but this is pretty close, that 10 years hence will cause him to take one side or the other on a question that he doesn't recognize as a question at all. In other words, in other words, this early childhood education, Lewis says, is so important because it's forming children's worldview. And it's not just that it's giving them the wrong answers. It's that it's teaching them which questions are important or which questions are open or closed, to discussion. And so I think it's incredibly formative in that way.
Absolutely. So for someone who may be watching or listening to this and, now their interest is piqued, what's a good starting point to just wade in or tiptoe into this classical movement or the classical Christian movement?
Yeah, there are a lot of ways that you can jump on. Again, like I said, this has become a really thick, deep network of resources. So let me just offer a couple of different kinds of maybe entry points. One would be to obviously get online and watch some videos. There are publishers, so Classical Academic Press and Memoria Press are two of the big ones. There are others as well, but those are the two largest. Both Classical Academic Press and Memoria Press and others, Canon Press, Veritas Press, etc., have curricular resources, have video resources, have teacher training, like Classical U is a service that Classical Academic Press offers. So there are lots of ways to get materials to start reading about things. If you want a little bit more of an academic entry point, I would encourage people to look at the journal Principia, a journal of classical education. I serve on the editorial board, one of the associate editors for that journal. And the whole point of that journal, it's a peer-reviewed academic journal, but it's interdisciplinary. So it brings scholars from different fields to the table. And so over the last couple of years, you'll see articles in those journals on a variety of topics. I have an article that's coming out in the next edition, the next volume here in 2024, called the Principles of Classical Education, which is intended to be a kind of philosophical exposition or explanation of some of these assumptions or principles that we're talking about that undergird the classical education paradigm. So that would be one way. If you're able to, I would encourage people to go to a conference. So many of these organizations, we've been talking more about schools than homeschooling, but there are big homeschooling conferences. Classical Conversations does classical homeschooling. If you can go to a Society for Classical Learning or Association of Classical Christian Schools or Circe Institute, there are others as well, but any of these organizations that have gatherings that are open to the public, I would encourage people to go and just get a feel for the culture and the people. It's a great group of people who are working in this space.
Excellent. And Glossa House, what I started with Dr. Fred Long about 12, 13 years ago, we've been building a Greek language curriculum. I know Latin is has sort of the stronghold there in the classical movement, but also some schools are doing biblical Greek.
There's a lot of Greek also. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got a K through 12 curriculum built, which is pretty incredible. We've got some rhetoric resources and other things, but so it's been a little challenging to break into the circles there. Like you said, some of the bigger publishers, they've been around a bit longer and produce some good resources. But yeah, hopefully we can get some of our stuff in front of folks. And yeah, well, I appreciate you carving some time out to meet Dr. Diener, and I want to put people onto your page. So just Google David Diener, and you'll go to his Hillsdale page, and you'll see some of his bibliography there, and some great things. So, and if you're looking,
my email address is there also. So if people have specific questions or want more resources, or I do a lot of speaking and consulting, also speaking for schools, teacher trainings, graduations, galas, whatever. So if people are interested in conversing more, I'm happy to dialogue. So my email address is there as well.
That's great. Before we go, can you say just a little bit about the program you were mentioning there at Hillsdale? What is that? What is the shape of that? What does that entail? So someone maybe listening that went through classical education and they're wondering, how do I get to the next step? Tell us a little bit about that program.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to. So we have an undergraduate, I'll just briefly mention both. We have an undergraduate program in classical education here at Hillsdale, and it's a minor. So all of our students here at Hillsdale choose a major, right? Math, philosophy, whatever, chemistry, etc., psychology, English. And so they have a major, and then they can take this classical education minor, which involves a series of courses, as well as an apprenticeship. And every year, about 12 to 14% of Hillsdale College graduates, the undergraduates, when they graduate, go into teaching positions in classical schools. So we are sending a lot of teachers out into the classical education movement. So that's a really neat program. You can do your major specialization in a field that you care about, and then also be prepared to walk out and get a job, right? And continue to serve classical education. The master's program that we started is currently a 2-year residential MA. So it's a master's in classical education. It's a 2-year residential MA that is tuition free, and students get a stipend if they're accepted. Our plan is to launch a hybrid version also in the summer of 2025, which would be for people who are full-time educational practitioners and can't actually move here to Hillsdale, Michigan for 2 years. So the structure of that program is really, it's a broad program designed for both people who want to be teachers and administrators. It involves the first year of the current structure. It's a 2-year structure. With the hybrid structure, it'll be a little bit longer. The first year is a fixed set of courses in the history of education, the philosophy of education, and then great texts. So the letters, right? Humane letters. So you kind of have a history, philosophy, and literature strand. And the idea is to really familiarize people with this tradition and the content of the tradition. There is a language requirement also for that program, classical languages, so Latin or Greek, as you were saying. And then in the second year, students have a series of options. There are some other required courses if they want to take courses, classical curriculum and pedagogy, etc. And then if they want to take courses on quadrivium, trivium, dig deeper into those areas of the liberal arts, if they want to go into the administrative kind of track and take courses in administration, we have a thesis option as well. So they can choose a number of different ways to finish that second year of the program.
Excellent. Well, man, it's been good to meet you, Dr. Diener, and I hope people will check out Hillsdale and check out your page there. And while you guys are at it, check out glossahouse.com and the Proof Text podcast and the Glossa House TV channel on YouTube. But we're going to wrap it up here, friends. We're going to stop here and say we hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.